Hello, St. Mark's. It's July 29th, 2020. I'm Matt Wright, and this is St. Mark's at Midweek. I'm glad you're here because you get to meet Ann Kelly, who's a St. Mark's member and senior lead researcher at the U.S.C. Showa Foundation. We're going to talk about her life as an oral historian. We're going to learn about what she does at the Showa Foundation, and we're also going to learn about how you can begin to collect oral histories from your own family and friends. It's easier than you think, and really fascinating work. So strap on your seatbelts. Let's get ready to say hi, Ann.
Hi.
I'm glad you could be with us today, and we are going to turn the tables on you a little bit because you are an accomplished oral historian, and we're going to get a little bit of your history on our podcast this morning. So I'm glad you're here. Are you ready?
Oh, I'm suddenly extremely nervous, but yes.
Well, currently you're working for the Showa Foundation, and I wonder, before we talk more about oral history generally and how that works, and also talk about how people can get oral histories from their own family members and friends, tell me a little bit about what you're doing now.
Sure. So yeah, like you mentioned, I currently work at the U.S.C. Showa Foundation. The Showa Foundation was actually founded in the early 90s by Steven Spielberg as part of an initiative to gather the interviews and the testimonies of Holocaust survivors in the wake of making his film Schindler's List. And so from that initial push, we have collected more than 55,000 video testimonies from around the world. They average a little bit more than 2 hours in length and have been conducted in 65 countries in 43 different languages. And the Showa Foundation as a whole, our mission is to develop empathy, understanding, and respect through testimony. So that specifically in capturing testimonies from genocide survivors. So not just the Holocaust, but also the Rwandan genocide, Cambodia, Guatemala, Armenian. We've partnered with collections from the Armenian genocide and other places as well. So I've been working there for about 3 years. And it's been one of the most incredible experiences of my life.
Tell me a little bit, if you can, about the project that you're doing right now, or that the foundation is doing right now, Dimensions in Testimony, because it looks just fascinating. And you might describe for people how it works. If you're somebody who's in this venue, walking down this hallway, I gather from looking at the video, stopping to ask questions of a screen, and all of a sudden the screen starts actually answering your specific question. It's really sort of mind-blowing. And the look on people's faces when people pop up and actually appear to be talking to them is just incredible.
Yeah, it's Dimensions in Testimony is one of the initiatives of U.S.C. Showa Foundation. So it is an offshoot, a collection that's called a interactive subject biography. So the goal of it comes from most genocide education in this country specifically, but actually around the world, comes from survivor interviews, comes from survivors actually coming into classrooms and speaking to students. However, with things like the Holocaust, we are rapidly approaching a period of time where that kind of firsthand subject knowledge and that kind of education is going by the wayside because people are aging out and passing away. And so the goal behind Dimensions in Testimony was to capture some part of that experience, that empathetic learning of getting to look somebody in the eye and ask them to tell you about their experiences. So it works off of artificial intelligence and natural language processing. And the goal, and part of my job as lead researcher, is to work a lot behind the scenes in order to facilitate this goal. But the goal is essentially that you can walk up to the system, press a button, say, "Hi, how are you?" And somebody on screen says, "I'm doing fine, how are you?" So that you have the experience of having a conversation. Even though all of the answers are pre-recorded, we don't put any words in anybody's mouths at all. It very much follows the methodology of oral history and testimony taking. But the ultimate goal really is to capture that human connection, that human element of getting to speak with somebody and hear them respond to your most pressing questions.
It's just fantastic.
I came to Showa Foundation completely with no genocide education background whatsoever. I actually came to it from a media background, had worked in oral history beforehand. And I have to say, I have gotten to meet and hear the stories of some of the most incredible people over the last few years. So.
Is it more daunting technically, or is it more daunting to get people who aren't, I'm assuming, not used to really doing this, to help them become accustomed to the process of getting this all down and organizing their thoughts so that they play back in some sort of coherent form to people asking questions?
Sure. Well, definitely there are technical issues that you have to come across. It's as with any media project. But actually, it's been fairly well documented that especially Holocaust survivors are very media savvy. One of the women that we interviewed, who actually passed away last year, her name is Eva Kaur. She had more Twitter followers than I think anybody at the Showa Foundation does. She just was very, very media savvy or technology savvy, because to so many of the people that we interview, and this is true about the testimony collection as well as Dimensions in Testimony, they are so driven to tell their story and to put their story out there so that people can learn from their experience, that any method of telling their story, books, Twitter, Instagram, BuzzFeed videos, whatever it is, any mode of telling their story is what they want to do. And so very often what we find is that they're more keen or more driven than even we are. And, this is our project. So it's gratifying and intimidating, and
you're being schooled by somebody twice your age or 3 times your age.
On a very regular basis. It's a humbling experience in so many ways. But really and truly, one of the things that people ask, actually people even at church have asked, is whether it's difficult emotionally to do it. And I have to say it's not, because we get to ask people about the totality of their lives. And yes, part of the reason we're interviewing them is because of a 2 to 4 to sometimes 6 year period that was intensely traumatic and world changing and individual changing. But it really is very often a story of resilience and rebuilding, because from that 2 to 4 year period, you get airplane manufacturers and world-renowned cellists and psychologists and factory owners and factory workers and parents and grandparents, and people always find a way to rebuild. And so it's a pretty powerful thing to see what these people have withstood, and that it's not just about withstanding, it's about building something bigger than themselves, and then using this traumatic, terrible point in their lives to actually push forward real and lasting change in the world.
How has COVID-19 impacted your work?
Pretty highly. I think it's impacted everyone. We are under the auspices of U.S.C, and so we have not been in the office since March. I think it was March. I can't even remember anymore. And we are very lucky that U.S.C has been as forthright and transparent about their decision-making as possible, always keeping the students and the staff really at the forefront of their thoughts in terms of our safety and the students' safety. But but it's also affected the way that we take interviews. We've had to start looking into ways of essentially doing the work that we do while also keeping the subjects' health and safety as paramount as possible, because we're dealing with a group who very often are in their 80s, 90s, even older than that. And so we always want to make sure that their safety is paramount.
Let me go to part two of our conversation, which is your background as an oral historian. Before you were with Showa Foundation, you were working in oral history and testimony taking. I'm imagining working for the Motion Picture Academy.
Yes.
You had that's a pretty, maybe a pretty glamorous way to take an oral history, or maybe, I'm assuming you talked to some glamorous people, but tell us a little bit more.
That would be the assumption when you say something like the Academy, right? Actually, so like I said, I tripped into this really on accident. I was a media historian. I got my master's also at U.S.C, fight on, in cinema and media studies. And while I was there, I looked for internships for people who had a near encyclopedic knowledge of film history and a lot of excitement about doing research. And that is a narrow field to begin with. So what I ended up doing was I was lucky enough to get an internship at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Oral History Department. And it opened me up to this new world of oral history. The thing about oral history that is really powerful, and the reason that I fell in love with it, and the reason that I think actually everybody should be aware of it, is that oral history is about the human experience of history. Very often when we talk about, like, you know, the winners who make history, or how historiography happens, how we decide how we talk about our past. Mm-hmm. Talk about documents, we talk about official state records, we talk about the things that get written down. And that is absolutely a valid and incredibly important part of history. Obviously, you don't get, you know, the United States Constitution without the Magna Carta, but there's also that element of those gaps in history, those things that are the lived experiences that aren't necessarily the spoken about experience, or the written down experiences. Mm-hmm. Those are things like the early days of the AIDS crisis in America. You had hundreds of thousands of people being affected by it who weren't necessarily leaving a lasting impression of documentation, though they were doing some. That is things like the coup in Argentina that led to the disappearance of thousands of people. These were people who did not get to leave a lasting trace. This was not an officially government-sanctioned program. But there are people who are still there, who have survived, who can speak to this experience, who can speak about what it was like at that time. And even on a family history basis, it is the difference between saying, oh, well, my grandfather, for instance, fought in World War II, as so many people's grandfathers did. And I can tell you the on-paper version, which is that he was a lieutenant in the Navy and he was on a battleship, or I could tell you the stories that my grandfather gave me about being a lieutenant on a battleship and what that meant for him. And that gives you context and color and connection to what would otherwise be just a historical event. And so it makes, I fell in love with oral history as a practice because it gives everyone and anyone the power to write history. Because the most important part of history, and this is what I learned at the Academy, and then continued at the Showa Foundation, the most important part of oral history is that you, the subject, you, the person being interviewed, this is your story start to finish. And so yes, we did interview some of the people who are more glamorous, to get back to your point, but we also interviewed lab technicians and script supervisors, mm-hmm. and continuity people and editors, and, you know, everybody from the person writing the screenplay to the person who's, you know, distributing the film. It takes a village to make a film.
It really does, yeah.
And so the goal of the Academy Oral History Project was really to capture that. And to ask people about all types. And so you would get interviews with people like Beverly Wood, who was VP at Deluxe Laboratories. And she talked about everything from how you created a very specific color in a David Fincher movie, all the way to what it was like being an African-American woman in Buffalo, New York in the 60s. And those are two things that you wouldn't necessarily see written down. So it was a really powerful 2 years that I got to spend there. And it was quite literally life-changing.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. And where are these histories available? Can people actually access these oral histories at the Academy?
Absolutely. So the easiest way to look for the academies is just to Google Academy Oral History Projects. But actually, while I was there, as part of the Pacific Standard Time Getty Grant, the Academy did this incredible set of oral histories that I highly suggest everybody check out, which was the Getty LA Project. And I can send you a list of it. Pretty much what the Academy did is interviewed, I think it ended up being over 20 filmmakers from Latin America and Latinx filmmakers working in Hollywood, basically to talk about what the experience of making films was in California, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Argentina, basically getting a more rounded and worldly view of the film industry. And it was incredible. It's in Portuguese, English, and Spanish, and you can toggle between the three. And yeah, so you can find that one. And then the U.S.C. Showa Foundation, you can always find at sfi.usc.edu and sign up for a free account so you can watch.
Oh, good. So before we go, I know people ask you from time to time how to get stories from their own family members. Most of us don't interview other people for a living. You and I do, but but it can be daunting for a grandson or a granddaughter to get grandmother or granddad sitting down in a chair and making them feel comfortable enough to start talking and sharing things that they might not otherwise be inclined to share. So how does somebody get started on that?
Sure. So this is one of my favorite things to do, is to just talk to people. Basically, what you are doing is you are having a structured conversation. In oral history, as opposed to actually even an interview like you and I are having, the point of the oral history is the oral history itself is this from the point where you start recording to the point that you end the recording. This is your primary source document for all the kids out there who've had to learn the difference between primary and secondary sources. So what you want to do, since you are helping co-create this primary source document, talking to your grandpa or your uncle or whomever, even your parent, you absolutely can interview your parents. I suggest it. Is first what you want to do is you want to do the research. Research can be a couple of things. You always want to talk to them first of all, because you need their consent to be interviewed. But you also just want to get the broad strokes of their story, decide where you're starting and where you're ending. You can do their full life story, which is what I suggest, but it'll take a little longer. You can focus in on some part of it. You can ask them what they think they want to talk about. And just sit down with them for a little while and just ask them to tell you a bit about their lives, even before you start recording. This is so that you guys get familiar with each other and start understanding how to talk to each other. And also so that everybody can start building a trust and a rapport. The other part of it is to do some actual online or when libraries were still open, research. So if you are interviewing somebody who lived during the 70s, what do you know about the 70s? If you are interviewing, for instance, I was helping on an interview of somebody who lived in Nuremberg in the 1940s. So I had to go learn a little bit about Nuremberg in the 1940s. If you're interviewing somebody who used to be a pilot, do a little bit of research on what a pilot is. You don't need to be the expert. They are the expert, but enough so that you get kind of a sense of what questions you should be asking. And then the next part for research is to write your list of questions out. This should be The important thing in oral history is, like I said, that you are interviewing the subject. They are the expert on their own lives, right? Because they're the first person witness for it. So aim for about 10 to 20 questions. And they should be pretty broad strokes. So no yes or no questions, because it is entirely too easy to say, were you born in Pasadena? Yes. Or if you say, when and where were you born? Usually what somebody will do is they'll start providing you context. I was born in Pasadena in 1976, and oh, I remember that it was like, people love filling in information like that. So open-ended questions will give you the most fruitful and large answers. And then the next part of it really is technology, which is actually probably at this day and age the easiest thing. When I first started doing oral history, it was much harder. But if you have a smartphone, you can record it on your smartphone. If you have Zoom, you can do it for about 40 minutes on Zoom for free, and you can still record it. And you can download it down that way, and just make sure that you test it beforehand. Have a clear understanding of how you're doing it technologically. So that's research and technology. And then the last part I would say is the interview itself. You've got your open-ended list of questions. Again, you write them out beforehand. But then you sit down and do your actual interview itself. The most important thing to know when you're doing an oral history interview, as opposed to a journalistic interview or anything else, is that you, the interviewer, are the least interesting person in the room. This is not about you. This is about them, right? Because that's why you're interviewing them. When I was talking to my grandfather, I had a lot of opinions on what he was saying, but they weren't particularly relevant because it was about my grandfather, which meant that, I will be totally honest, we got about 15 minutes on just his growing up in Elgin. I didn't want to hear about Elgin. It turned out to be one of the more incredible things that I had learned from him. So have your list of questions, start asking them, but let them guide you. People, it's a conversation. They will guide you where you want to go. There's no real wrong way to do this, as long as you're both comfortable. That said, don't try to trick anybody. You are not Barbara Walters. Oh God, is that too old of a reference?
No, I think it's okay.
Okay, but you're not trying to trap anybody or trick anybody. It's rude, and also, you're trying to make them as comfortable as possible talking to you, because it's weird. I feel very nervous right now, and I'm talking about something that I know pretty well.
Right.
So you want to be as welcoming and exciting as possible. Anybody is always free to text or email me questions. I have a list of just starter questions that you can do, just about 35 questions. You can choose 10 to 20 off of them. And you are more than free to use that. I've got tons and tons of resources. If you don't want to talk to me, or if you want to do some digging of your own online, a really good place to check is Oral History in the Digital Age, which is a website that basically teaches you how to do it and shows you what tools you need, and also gives you recommendations. Or you can also look at, it's called 50 Questions to Ask Relatives About Family History.
Oh, good.
And that, if you get through 50 questions, let me tell you what, that will be an 8-hour-long interview, but it will probably be one of the most interesting ones that you've been part of. And really and truly, the most important part of all of this is just to have fun with it. If you're having fun, then the person you're interviewing is having fun. This is really just designed to be your opportunity to connect better with a little bit of your own history.
One final question. Once everybody has corralled the family and gotten the questions ready, sat down, recorded it, it's a wonderful oral history. Mm-hmm. How do we archive it and keep it and make sure that it is playable and presentable to somebody 10 or 20 years down the line? How do we keep from losing track of it?
Oh my gosh. Well, first thing you do is enroll in an MLIS program. No, I'm joking. Oh my gosh, I'm joking. The easiest way to do it the easiest way to capture and then keep your media, if you're an amateur archivist like me, basically, is to download it as an M4A file. Those tend to be the longest lasting. Or if that just seems entirely too confusing for you, honestly, Vimeo or YouTube.
Okay.
Just upload it onto Vimeo or YouTube. Vimeo actually, I will say, allows you to, if this is something that you're concerned about, allows you to hold the ownership over the file. So for those who are worried about, like, if I put it on YouTube, does Google own it? The answer is kind of,
Probably.
sort of yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can put it on Vimeo, and you can always access it that way as long as Vimeo lasts, and Vimeo has so far lasted a very long time. But the other way, honestly, to do it is to just download it as an M4A file and keep it close. M4A or WAV files also work. WAVs are a little bit longer lasting. You also can shoot me an email and I'll help you with the technical parts of it. And I also would encourage anybody who does this, local historical societies are an underappreciated gift. Local museums, local historical societies, local libraries are always, always staffed and full of people who want to help you look into local history and help you with local history. I will give you the weirdest example that I can. I've talked a lot about my grandfather because my grandfather was inadvertently my entrance into oral history. I interviewed him when I was in high school. He left behind him hundreds and possibly thousands of slides of circuses and parades. You know, everybody's got a hobby. He was a shutterbug in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, all the way up to, and he loved making slides. Nobody had any absolute idea what to do with that amount of stuff. What do you do with that amount of stuff? The answer is, it turns out there is a historical society just devoted to circuses. And so we contacted them and they gave us helpful pointers on what to do with some of the slides. Some of it we could donate to them and some of it we could preserve other ways. So if you if you find family home movies, if you find old cassette tapes that have people's, recordings on them, whatever you find, honestly and truly, there is an archive or a historical society or a library out there who can help you with this. And that includes stuff that you're recording now too. There is an initiative by the Oral History Association, the OHA, to start doing COVID-19 interviews. And this would, if you do a project like this would absolutely qualify for it. And let me tell you what, historians love history. So if you reach out to them and say, hey, I have this, I don't really know what to do with it, or where I can donate it, or who I can talk to about preserving it, let me tell you what, you'll have oral historians just chomping at the bit to help you. So look local, and also just hit up the resources around you, because, and that goes for all media types. If you're like me right now, cleaning out your garage right now and finding all sorts of weird stuff, there are LA historical societies, there are Pasadena specific ones, there's the Junior League. Hit up everybody, talk to everybody.
Well, Ann Kelly, I want to say thank you. You've been a wonderful subject.
Oh, well, thank you. This has been, it's been nice to be on the other side of the microphone.
Ann Kelly, Senior Lead Researcher at the U.S.C. Showa Foundation, and one of the great people that makes St. Mark's go. That's it for this edition of St. Mark's at Midweek. Thanks to our associate producers, Emily Wright and Lucy Grindon. Another update from St. Mark's next Wednesday, and our regular worship podcast on Sunday. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and be good to each other. I'm Matt Wright.